Go in blind. So saith every From fan when advising a first time player. Your first time is special, you don't want to spoil it, etc., etc. I did not listen to them because I did not know better, or rather, since I did not know anything about the game, because I did not suspect better, but for the purposes of critique, for the very purpose that I am writing this piece. The cultish fan base From's games since Demon Souls have cultivated struck me as too insulated, and I suspected, correctly, that Elden Ring, despite its apparent turn toward the masses and going open world and plastering George's name everywhere, finish the book, you fat fuck, was going to end up being obtuse and opaque in ways Mike's fan club just can't see or accept anymore because they're so used to it that they've lost perspective. In order to expose that properly, I, despite my better judgment, went into Elden Ring blind, and I believe the best way to introduce Elden Ring's failures in player communication, that is, between the game and the player, is a recount of the beginning of my first playthrough. To clarify, before playing Elden Ring, my only experience with a From game was a few hours of Dark Souls 2 when it first came out. I didn't understand what was going on or what I was doing, and on the whole, found the experience frustrating. I played it for one day and never went back to it. Other than it being a confusing experience, I remember little about those few hours, so I feel safe in labeling myself effectively a complete Souls noob stepping into Elden Ring. I picked the astrologer starting setup purely because I know from reputation that Souls fans seem to hate magic and think it cheapens the game, so naturally I chose to play that way out of spite. My only dilemma was choosing between faith or intelligence spells. My role-playing brain said go faith because the prophet's lore blurb seemed thematically appropriate, but I ended up choosing intelligence because between the two, by my very cursory judgment, Souls fans seemed to hate intelligence more than faith. Blah blah opening cutscene, blah blah tutorial cave, blah blah epic door opening, wow Limgrave. The sight of Grace having an actual objective pointer was a pleasant surprise, but I also immediately suspected it to be a sort of troll. After all, it was pointing directly towards a huge guy in gold armor on a horse, and these games are known for being difficult, and I had no horse, nor any apparent way to level up, and I intuited pretty much immediately that Goldie Boy was going to be too much to take on right off the bat, statistically speaking. I tried fighting him a couple times to confirm, and the writing was on the wall when I saw how pitiful my damage was against him. I tried going to my left, down to the beach, but I immediately ran into a troll who also seemed to take fairly pitiful damage, so I bravely ran away. So forward was a no-go, and left was a no-go. Might as well try going right, and this seemed promising. I was able to snipe the bats flying down at the edge of the lake easily, so in terms of the level spread of the opponents immediately around me, this direction appeared to be the weak point. So down the cliff I jumped into the lake in the middle of Limgrave. What exactly I was supposed to do beyond find items, I wasn't sure at this point. The game obviously had a leveling system and a currency for it, but wouldn't allow me to actually do so, and there was absolutely no hint as to how I might acquire it. Now, if you've played the game, you can probably guess where this is going, but I assure you it's actually worse than you think it is, due to a completely unjustifiable design choice I will expound on shortly that almost no one seems to be aware exists. If you guessed I hit the teleporter chest, congratulations, you get a meat dumpling. So there I am in Caelid, which, as you may know, is scaled higher than Liurnia as a level 7 caster. I kept trying to fight my way up and, I thought, out dozens of times, only to finally accept I didn't have enough flasks to kill all the enemies on that path, and I didn't have the patience to try to kill them with my unimproved short sword. So I tried going down, as unintuitive as that was. When that immediately netted me a sight of grace, my preconceived notions of how these games were designed seemed to be totally confirmed. That is, they trolled, trapped, and tricked the player in sadistic glee. This was the third time the game had thwarted my attempt to explore the map, and I was done with it. I did not care that I could teleport out of Caelid and back to Limgrave. I was not playing ball with what the game intended me to do any longer, since what it appeared to be intending me to do was run away from everything. I was sure there was some intended path where I'd poke around the lake some more, but I was no longer interested in finding it. I was going to fight my way back to Limgrave through Caelid, no matter how spongy all the enemies were, or that all but the weakest could one-shot me. Power leveling a character by going to Caelid before Liurnia is far from unheard of. I'd even argue it's basically standard practice if over-leveling is not something that concerns you. Galloping around on Torrent, nabbing items while dodging any serious opposition, usually culminating in spending half an hour whacking at Grail's tail for some level ups, is a straightforward way to jump the leveling curve. But I did not actually have the tools to execute this power leveling strategy, as I lacked both Torrent and the ability to level up. Items I most certainly could find. Over the 10 hours I spent waging my guerrilla campaign within Caelid, I found all sorts of things, though few of them I could actually use since I lacked the stats to equip them. You may wonder how that could be, since enemies in Caelid are worth more runes than those in Limgrave, but as I said, I could not level up. And I did not gain the ability to do so for my entire stint in Caelid. It was only once I acquired a couple stone sword keys and decided to teleport back to the Fringe Folk hero's grave to use them, lest I forget about it, that this problem eventually rectified. Again, being unable to level up the dungeon was a frustrating waste of time that I only partially explored before also giving up on it. I was at this point nearly ready to write the game off. I had poked my way through half of Caelid and come back with a haul of weaponry I was itching to use, but no matter how long I played, or how many runes I gained and then lost, I was unable to level my character, and there was absolutely zero indication of how to acquire that ability. As a last resort, I decided to go back to the lake and work my way east towards Caelid. The last thing I had done there was to talk to the finger reader and activate the grace near her, and hope that the game might finally start making sense on my way there. Indeed, had I not thought I would lack the credibility to tear the shit out of the game without first completing it, I may very well have dropped the game at this point. Lo and behold, however, after fucking around south of the lake and eventually sitting at the Grace by the road on the east side, Melina appeared. 11 fucking hours into the game, and I could finally level up, or at least I could have if the tens of thousands of runes I had gathered up to that point I hadn't lost in that time. I was finally able to properly play the game, but I had, aside from my collection of unusable loot, accomplished essentially nothing in all that time. You see, it turns out, if you read the wiki, that Melina will only appear to let you level up after activating 3 outdoor graces in Limgrave, and only in Limgrave. Graces activated anywhere else on the map do not count. You can activate every other grace you can find. Melina will never appear. Other than fucking with the player for its own sake, I cannot think of a single justifiable reason why this is the case. It serves absolutely no purpose whatsoever except to fuck over anyone who gets caught in the teleporter chest before meeting Melina, but who doesn't immediately leave. I cannot tell you whether this is intentional or just a poorly coded oversight, but the effect is the same either way. Someone who now considers this game one of his favorites ever made very nearly dropped it due to how atrocious my first impression of it was. This design error is emblematic of the faulty way quest steps are laid out and activated in Elden Ring, with the game making very specific assumptions about how the player will traverse the map, and should these assumptions prove false, calls the entire quest line to derail, never to be salvaged. The criteria required to cause Melina to appear are the earliest example. After all, Melina's appearance is a mandatory part of the main quest. The game assumes the first 3 graces you activate in the overworld will be in Limgrave, since that is the starting area, but has absolutely no contingency for if the player strays outside Limgrave. They are unlikely to do so overland, granted, but even so, I see no compelling reason why non-Limgrave graces should not count towards the quest trigger. The fact a teleporter chest exists very close to your starting point that will take you outside of Limgrave makes it completely unacceptable in any case. The assumption that every player who gets teleported to Caelid will immediately leave is ridiculous. This isn't the only example of this problem, naturally. God forbid you go the wrong way in Nokron and end up on the Aqueduct to Deeproot Depths path to the right instead of the path to the Fingerslayer blade to the left, or you could short circuit both Ronnie's and Fia's quest lines. There's no way to know Fia ends up down there without stumbling across her. If you end up finding Godwin in the Deeproot Depths before you cause Fia to teleport there, you have no way to know that's where she went, and therefore it is practically impossible to find her and thus unlock her ending. This happened to me on my first playthrough. Likewise, if you've already gotten to Astel via the coffin elevator in the Deeproot Depths before you give Ronnie the Fingerslayer blade, it is practically impossible to continue her quest line because the teleporter from Rena's Rise will simply take you to an area you've already been to, meaning you are unlikely to see the option to talk to the Ronnie doll from resting at a grace down in the Ainsel River. My first time through, I even recognized that the seal on the barrier after Astel's boss arena was Ronnie's and went back down there to see if progressing her quest line had lowered the barrier, but it didn't, because you have to talk to her in the Ainsel River and fight Blythe first, and since I'd already cleared that area, I had no way to know that quest step existed. That put an end to Ronnie's quest line and ending for me as well. The quest triggers in this game are simply flimsy. They lack, what should I call it, robustness? They assume the player will take a particular path through the game, and if you deviate from it, and this isn't an exploit or something, From allows you to do so with no restriction whatsoever, it becomes practically impossible to pick up the quest sequence again through normal gameplay without reading the wiki to see where you went wrong. Map progression assumptions aren't the only way the game prevents you from completing quests. Several quest lines, most notably Hyeda's and Millicent's, rely on reloading the map in order to progress. This means the quest can appear to have dead-ended for no reason because you were meant to somehow know that you need to rest at a grace after that particular quest step in order to progress to the next one. Hyeda, for instance, needs a map reset in order to get new dialogue after you tell her about the eyes. NPC dialogue doesn't usually work this way, so there's no reason to think that's what you need to do. Hyeda just throws up and won't say anything more. As far as you know, carrying on with your adventure, that's the end of her mini quest line. Millicent's is vastly worse, relying on an entire series of back and forth level loads right from the beginning, plus requiring a rest at the Windmill Village to appear there. I never finished Millicent's questline my first playthrough because I missed the very last teleport before she relocates to Altus, meaning I never found her there and never did her questline. The Windmill Village reload is also an obvious point of failure. Imagine you don't want to fight all the enemies you killed on the way up, so you activate the Grace and leave rather than rest there. Millicent won't spawn until your next Grace rest, at which point you've left the village and don't know she's there, ergo, no more quest. Now, there's two schools of thought on this. One is that the quests are designed this way out of negligence, that quests work this way in Dark Souls, and From did not change their approach, despite Elden Ring being an open world, and therefore allowing the game to be approached in a much more free-form manner. In that case, this is simply sloppy game design, an unwelcome inheritance from prior games that no one thought to modify to fit new circumstances. The other is that the quest steps are intentionally hyper-specific because Mike wants the quests and their rewards to be somewhat esoteric and hidden in order to feel more rewarding to those who end up finding them. Now, I have no argument against that if that is the intention. He succeeded in that case, but it doesn't give me any reason to value it if I am not one of those lucky enough to stumble upon said content by chance. If anything, I'm disincentivized from doing so. Perhaps I simply have a spiteful streak to me, but if you intentionally try to hide game content from me, I see no reason to value that content. You haven't earned my investment in it. You presume it. You presume the fact I can't find it makes me want it more, but if the reason it's hidden from me is intended obtuseness on your part, then I don't value it at all. This isn't the same as missing secrets in Doom 2016. There, my missing the secret is due to me failing the skill test they represent, an observational slash navigational one to be exact. It's my fault for not noticing them. In Elden Ring, logical deduction and observation usually cannot help you deduce an obscured quest step. It is not a skill test, Ergo, it is fair to blame the game, rather than the player, for not finding them. I mentioned Doom 2016 very intentionally because the way it hides secrets, especially if you do not hunt for them on the map screen and do not purchase the proximity detector upgrade, I consider the gold standard for hidden content, in direct contrast to something like Elden Ring's illusory walls. Illusory walls are the second most insulting aspect of Elden Ring's game design, hiding content behind textures that in most cases it is simply impossible to deduce are illusory. When you enter a dungeon and it just ends, like the cave leading to the Altus Divine Tower or the antechamber to the boss room of the Black Knife Catacombs, the presence of an illusory wall is fairly obvious, but in most other cases, like the one leading from the Shadow Keep to Midra, or the one leading to the Volcano Manor dungeon, or the one leading to the Celia Hideaway, or any number of others, the presence of the illusory wall is not obvious or even hinted at whatsoever. It may be obvious there is a seemingly accessible area, such as in Volcano Manor, but that there is an illusory wall leading to it, let alone where that illusory wall is not obvious whatsoever. Bro, just read the messages, people always mark them. Shut the fuck up. The vast majority of messages claiming to mark illusory walls are trolls. For all a new player knows, there are no illusory walls, because they are almost certain to be tricked into whacking random walls many times before they ever come across a real illusory wall, at which point they would justifiably assume any message claiming to mark one is another troll and ignore it. That's not a justifiable way of hinting at the existence of illusory walls and never will be, unless you're willing to put up with being trolled constantly on the minuscule chance you're not being lied to this time. I find such behavior insulting, so I do not. That's why I've played offline since my first playthrough, and thus why I missed all the illusory walls in Shadow of the Erdtree, since I again made the mistake of playing it without the wiki. I normally give people the benefit of the doubt, and with how much was copied from Dark Souls to Elden Ring, I'd have some justification, but shit like illusory walls makes me lean towards thinking deliberately hiding content, whether locations or quests, is the correct interpretation of the game's design, especially if you consider my next point about some of the puzzles. I said illusory walls were the second most insulting aspect of the game's design. But number one has to be the intentionally misleading puzzles, two of which stand out to me immediately. The first is the puzzle to unlock the converted Fringe Tower. Even if you deduce from the hint that you need to use the erudition emote, there is no way to deduce the hidden requirement that you do so while wearing a glintstone crown. Nothing indicates you need to do this. The second is the statue blocking the path behind the Shadow Keep needed to get to Shadowview and the Finger Ruins of Deo. The game literally gives you a hint that indicates there is a puzzle in the room, but it is not actually a hint. You are implicitly told there is something hidden there, but given no hint as to how to uncover it. There is, again, absolutely no way to intuit how to get the statue to move, yet the game has the gall to troll you itself by telling you it's possible. At least the Fringe Tower only locks away a couple sorceries. This statue doesn't just lock off a large chunk of the map, a la the illusory wall hiding the entire path to Midra, but also all the lore you discover there, as well as Ymir's questline, which itself is also vital to understanding the game's lore. But in either case, content is not merely being hidden, but the player is being actively fucked with. The game trolls and misleads the player, making the information necessary to access the content impossible to find, yet dangling the keys in front of you the whole time. You don't even get to pass by in ignorance like you can with illusory walls. You know there is something being hidden from you, but you will never be given a hint of how to access it. Even if you insist you don't care about this game's writing or any of the quests, the obscurantism doesn't end there. Discussing that issue merely followed naturally from my initial example. Hiding gameplay mechanics is a rampant problem as well, if my ordeal trying to level up didn't already clue you into that. Consider spirit summons. If for any reason you never teleport back to the Grace at the Church of LA after talking to Melina, you will not receive the spirit calling bell because Ronnie will only appear at that site of grace. I, for instance, did not enter that church until I had already explored everything east of it and had killed the tree sentinel. I then spent the runes I acquired from him, buying what I needed from Kale, and carried on, never to return. The only reason I ever acquired the bell, and was thus able to summon anything, was because I teleported back there much later, as I needed smithing stones, and I'd forgotten whether Kale sold any. He didn't. Had I remembered he didn't, or had I had the stones I needed, I would not have done so, and therefore would never have gotten the ability to summon spirits no matter how many I picked up. Supposedly the item will appear at the Twin Husks at some point if you don't talk to Ronnie at the church, but even the wiki doesn't state what the trigger is, so I cannot personally confirm it. Either way, once again, the trigger is too particular. There is no reason it could not occur at any site of grace, as the player will inevitably teleport to one at some point. Locking the interaction to a single site serves no purpose except as punishment for not reading the devs' minds. This sort of thing is only the tip of the iceberg, though, because other omissions are omnipresent, such as the poise meter. I don't want to hear any cope from the From Defense Force about how having to guess poise damage from repeated use that will never be fully accurate is fine, and you're just bad if you can't figure it out. Because by that very same logic, I can justify getting rid of any UI element that tells the player what is happening numerically, such as damage pop-ups, your health, mana, and stamina bars, status bars, and even weapon stats. And also, it makes Sekiro a casual game for showing it, something none of them would ever claim. This standard only applies when it's absent, evidently. There is nothing to justify poise not getting a bar while everything else does. It just makes going for poise breaks a continual guessing game or crapshoot. Yet it is absent. The same is true of status effects on enemies, which are hidden until the meter maxes out and the max out effect is applied. The lack of an indicator as to what statuses you may or may not be inflicting, and to what degree, means it is impossible to, for instance, determine whether you are wasting your sleep pots on an enemy who is immune to sleep without wasting a bunch of sleep pots, which might not be so bad if they weren't a consumable, meaning you have to tediously grind for ingredients in order to use it more than intermittently. The same is also true of stats for non-weapon attacks. Items and spells, for some fucking reason, do not get a damage breakdown screen like weapons and armor do. They just list the stat scaling, and stat scalings themselves are already sort of obscured from the player by using letter grades instead of the exact damage multipliers. The only way to know how much damage they do is to use them against an opponent with no weaknesses or resistance to its damage types, something that is impossible to know for sure without looking it up. Again, like with the poise meter, I don't want to hear one peep about how you don't need it and you're just bad if you want it, because by the same logic, weapons shouldn't get a stats breakdown either, yet they do. Why should weapons get it but nothing else? There is no logical reason, of course. It does nothing but add a layer of obfuscation to the gameplay for casters and crafters. Hell, why stop with attacks? This problem applies to most item effects. It makes picking things like, say, your mind level more difficult because you cannot see how much mana a blue flask will replenish until you pumped it high enough that you see it no longer fills the bar. It also makes judging the exact effects of things like talismans difficult to discern since they have only text descriptions, not a stats page. If they affect a stat visible on the stat screens, like resistances or HP, it's not so bad, but effects that are not, like that of the Great Shield Talisman, or the Radagon Icon, or the Blue Dancer Charm, or what have you, have effects that can only be guessed at. And while talismans that, say, buff damage can easily be tested by attacking something, then equipping the talisman, then attacking the same target and seeing the difference in damage, this is an irritating level of obfuscation that doesn't need to exist. You don't need to do this to, for instance, know what change in damage you will get from upgrading or infusing a weapon. It tells you directly. There is no logically consistent reason why the same courtesy is not extended to things that are not weapons unless we assume that the developers really don't see anything but weapons, and only the weapon itself, Ashes of War don't get any stats page either, to be important, and therefore explicit revelation of their stats is not necessary. Indeed, so unnecessary that they feel it would be a waste of time to even allow the option to view them. Yet this can't be the case, not truly, or else the game would not be filled with such a deluge of useful things that are not weapons. If they actually had such an attitude, they would not be such a massive part of the game. It strikes me more as a bias in interest, a bias in focus, one that did not cause them to make the game entirely weapon focused, but instead caused them to simply neglect items and spells in subtle ways, ways that no one even thought to point out. Yet the effect reveals the bias all the same, because we have certain things, weapons and armor, for which the player is given detailed information, while for others, items and spells, they are not. There is no logical reason why the former should be detailed and the latter not. It is simply that no one, apparently, ever cared enough that they even thought about giving everything in the game a stat breakdown rather than just weapons and armor. The effect, on a mechanical level, is to drive those who use items and spells heavily towards the wiki, since the game will not provide the information they need, while those who rely on weapons are mostly well served by the in-game interface and do not require external assistance to understand the game, in this respect anyway. Although, again, you still have the issues like scaling using letters instead of numbers and what have you. And that the game has these irritants that drive people towards the wiki is my point, and is why I want these problems corrected, because there are obvious benefits to playing the game blind. The people who tell you to do so are not wrong about that. What they are wrong about is refusing to accept that there are elements of the game that make blind playthroughs frustrating as well, and may well cause people to sacrifice the wonder and excitement of exploring the lands between without prior knowledge in order to understand things about how the game works that the game is refusing to divulge for poor or no reason. It's a completely unnecessary friction that could either drive people away, encourage them to spoil the game, or make their first playthrough frustrating depending on how they react to it. I don't want to see any of those outcomes because I love this game and I want to see others enjoy it too, which is why I find needlessly irritating elements of the game, such as outlined here, so frustrating given the evident quality of the overall package. And before anyone asks, yes, I am holding From to a higher standard than Bethesda. That's why I'm going on this long about Elden Ring being bad at giving the player needed information, and not Skyrim, despite the issue being catastrophically worse in that game. Bethesda so consistently fucks things up, it's genuinely shocking any of their games are enjoyable. My expectations for them are justifiably low. My only serious experience with From Software's work is Elden Ring, and it's such a great game that I feel it warrants a higher standard than what some of its own design elements actually reach. I actually have some degree of faith in the ability of this design team to make a great game, which is why I feel the need to point out anything in their work that detracts from that greatness. Lack of communication with the player is one of those things. Something that threatens to counteract elements of the game that do work really well by driving them towards reading a wiki, which almost guarantees they will spoil the game. I don't want to see that happen, and I hope From doesn't either. So long as the game remains as it is, however, there is no perfect solution. For a mechanically smooth, completionist experience where you get to interact with as much of the game in as frictionless a manner as possible, reading the wiki is basically a requirement. However, doing so will totally rob you of the experience of discovering everything in the game for yourself, for the first time, as something new and unexpected. That thrill, which you will experience constantly on a blind run, which I found to drive me through the game and make every fight I take mean something, is forfeited. You must choose one or the other. You must choose whether you value a smooth player experience over the thrill of discovery, or vice versa. You cannot have both. It should not and does not need to be that way, but it is. And I feel new players are owed this information so they can pick the course of action that suits them best, rather than being misled with the usual refrain of you gotta do it blind, you gotta do it blind, only for them to find themselves tearing their hair out at the game's obtuseness. Though realistically, I suspect that refrain will continue because Miyazaki's fan club probably doesn't consider most, if anything, that I've laid out here as a flaw with the game to be so. For their lord is a perfect man who can do no wrong. His naysayers are merely scrubs who refuse to get good, and they must be scorned and cast out for their shittery. Praise the sun, behold dog, hidden path ahead.